This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. This episode is produced in partnership with the Jacob Robinson Institute for the History of Individual and Collective Rights at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. My guest today is a postdoctoral fellow at the Robinson Institute. He specializes in minority rights and Jews in Estonia in the interwar period, having recently received his PhD in history from the University of Vienna. Dr. Timo Aava, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, happy to be here.
So your analysis of minority rights revolved around the concept of non-territorial autonomy. Can you start by explaining what it is?
Yes, correct. Non-territorial autonomy is a model to basically accommodate ethnic diversity within a bigger multi-ethnic state. And according to this model, you wouldn't divide a state into territorial units for each nationality. You would rather create kind of bodies, non-territorial bodies, where members of these respective nations could join. And the broader idea is to either avoid ethnic conflicts and tensions where you cannot create such a neat territorial units for each nationality. And then also avoid the collapse of a bigger state into smaller nation states. And this idea was heavily discussed since late 19th century and early 20th century in the Habsburg Empire, which was a vast multi-ethnic empire. And some parts of this empire were ethnically so diverse that creating neat units for Germans and Czechs would have been too complicated. And in such a context, one Austrian politician, Karl Renner, came up with the idea of establishing national autonomous bodies for each nationality.
So it was essentially a cultural arrangement?
Yes, in various projects proposing non-territorial autonomy, culture is usually in the foreground, but in various projects, the powers that these national autonomous bodies would have, these can vary greatly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the heyday of the non-territorial autonomy model came in the interwar period after. Funnily enough, you said it started under the Habsburg Empire, but it actually came to a head when the Habsburg Empire ceased to exist and broke up into not just the Habsburg Empire, but Europe in general broke up into several nation states. How did the idea evolve in the age of the nation state?
Well, various national movements, various politicians in the late imperial period discussed this model. And when the map of Europe was radically changed after the First World War, then new nation states were also faced with the question of ethnic diversity. And several states promised rights protection for minorities, and some states really introduced legislations based on the non-territorial autonomy model. And Baltic states are here particularly interesting case, which all three introduced various autonomy models for nationalities within these states. And Estonia in particular, very often in literature stands out as an example which introduced perhaps the best example of non-territorial autonomy legislation of the era.
Why was it the best example?
Scholars emphasize that it basically, to the fullest extent, utilized these underlying ideas. Basically, the idea was that each nationality in Estonia, with at least 3,000 citizens, could establish their own national self-government body to administer schooling and cultural affairs. And schooling, was the most important affair. Each individual could freely, based on their individual choice, join the respective self-government body, and via this have the freedom to send their children, for instance, to the minority schools. But they were also then had to pay, for instance, taxes for the respective minority self-government budget.
Okay, but this was exceptional. I mean, in other countries, it wasn't successful to that extent. It wasn't this, given so much autonomy. I mean, what makes Estonia stand apart?
Yes, if you look at the Baltic context, then, for instance, in Latvia, there was schooling autonomy, and autonomy was limited to schooling affairs. And in Lithuania, we also know there was Jewish autonomy, which is always mentioned in the literature, but this was only quite a short-lived experiment, only until 1926. But in the Estonian case, these autonomies actually functioned up until the very end of Estonian statehood in 1940. And when Konstantin Päts established his authoritarian rule, these minority self-governments were also kind of restricted, and they were under more strict state control, but they continued their work in the new authoritarian framework.
When we're talking about minorities in interwar Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, I mean, comes to mind certainly here in Israel, but I'm guessing that also elsewhere, the Jews, right? That there was a substantial minority and also an outstanding one. But it does. The whole system doesn't apply only to Jews. They weren't the only beneficiaries of the model. Yeah,
after the First World War, more broadly, the makers of the post-World War order discussed how to defend minorities in these new states. And then the Jewish delegations at the Paris Peace Conference were the most ardent supporters of non-territorial autonomy provisions, which actually, in the end, did not realize, because the minority treaties were a much softer version of what was initially proposed. But in the Estonian case, actually, the main kind of nexus was between Germans and Estonians. Germans had been the dominant elite in the Baltic region for several centuries. The noble knighthoods, they governed in many aspects of the life. Baltic Germans dominated the economic life. They were the big landowners. So to a large extent, when Estonia established its independent statehood, then passing such an autonomy legislation was having Germans in mind. And some scholars have stressed that it was kind of a compensation for the former elite of losing their status. But to a very important extent, also Estonia's Jews participated in this campaign for achieving autonomy. They sent their proposals to the Constituent Assembly. When the law was discussed in the parliament, then they sent their proposals and ideas how it should be designed and so on.
Even though the Jews in Estonia at the time weren't a sizable minority at all. I mean, you said that the minimum was 3,000 strong community. The Jews were just above that. How did they interact with? You said that the Germans were the substantial minority that everyone had in mind in the Estonian context. How did the Jews interact with the other minorities under the provisions of those minority rights provisions?
In the early days of trying to achieve the law, they occasionally cooperated with Germans in exchanging law drafts and then providing their ideas how the law should be carved out. And yes, the minimum threshold was 3,000, and it was exactly designed based on the number of Jews in Estonia. The maximum was 5,000, so it was between, let's say, 3,000 and 5,000. So this number was exactly designed after the number of Jews. So there would be also opportunity for them to establish their self-government. And when the law was passed, and Germans, who had been the main campaigners in the parliament, they quickly established their self-government, and the Jews were the second. They also quickly started establishing their self-government body, and in this process, they also heavily relied on the experience of Germans, how to design their institutions, their taxation system, and so on.
Did this cooperation, or perhaps mutual, cross-fertilization, if you will, continue? Said that the model, the non-territorial autonomy model, persisted in Estonia until the very end of Estonian independence in the 1940s. So even after Nazism had risen in Europe, etc., did this cooperation between the Jews and the Germans in Estonia continue into the 1930s?
Well, they are based on the minutes of the Jewish self-government, the council and government. In the initial phase, there was contact and collaboration, but in the later stages, there wasn't so much cooperation anymore necessarily. And one example of a German-Jewish collaboration is perhaps the European Nationalities Congress. So briefly, after the Baltic Germans had achieved introducing this law in Estonia, they established a bigger body in interwar Europe to kind of propagate non-territorial autonomy model more broadly in Europe. And in this big European Nationalities Congress, which basically represented millions of minorities in Europe, there Germans and Jews were the most important forces, basically the leading forces, the leading groups within the organization. And yes, when the Nazi Germany came to power, then this organization was also kind of hijacked by Germans, pro-Nazi Germans, and then Jews stopped collaborating within this institution, and they left the European Nationalities Congress.
What can you tell us about the Jews of Estonia at the time? Where did they come from?
Well, it was a small minority. It was almost exclusively urban minority. Scholars have emphasized that Estonian Jews were perhaps most urbanized Jewish community in Europe. They had come mostly from the rest of the Soviet Russian Empire during the Russian Empire period. And this community formed mostly since the second half of the 19th century. Of course, there had been presence during the earlier centuries as well, but these had been mostly former soldiers who could then stay in Baltic provinces. There were university students, there were smaller merchants, and so on.
Well, did they integrate into the broader Estonian society? I mean, did they speak Estonian? Did they see themselves as Estonian, I don't know, citizens or subjects or whatever?
And yes, scholars have also emphasized that they were a relatively secularized community, so the religion did not play such an important role in everyday life. And yet they were, on the one hand, small community, but on the other hand, they were active in various professions and had in such a case strong contacts with the locals as well. And linguistically, diverse again, Russian speaking, Yiddish speaking, and also Estonian speaking, and also, of course, Hebrew, which became increasingly an important issue within the self-government body. Then there was the question, what should be the national language, the Yiddish or Hebrew, the language of instruction at schools.
And how was it decided? Tell our listeners.
This is the question that was perhaps the most heated topic throughout the very existence of the self-government. The majority of the Cultural Council decided that Hebrew should be the national language and the language of instruction at schools. And there was always a strong and very vocal pro-Yiddish faction within the Cultural Council. So the dominant forces, they tried to implement these policies, have stronger emphasis of Hebrew at schools. And this was, of course, strongly opposed by the other camp. But in reality, the situation actually varied by school and school level. And actually, depending on the class and school level, children learned either in Hebrew, in Yiddish, or Russian, and some courses in Estonian as well.
And another fault line, another division was around the question of pro-Zionist versus non-Zionist.
Exactly. And here it's more or less corresponds with pro-Yiddish and pro-Hebrew forces propagating Hebrew as the national language, were also had strong Zionist sympathies.
So would you say that by and large the pro-Zionist, pro-Hebrew prevailed at the end of the day? They were the most dominant force within Estonian Jewry.
Exactly, yeah. And the self-government also kind of strongly centered around this Zionist goal. Already at the very early days, when they discussed before the passing to law, when all Estonian Jewish community convened to design their agenda and political program. On the one hand, they decided that they want to achieve autonomy in Estonia, but on the other hand, they said that we support the idea of creating a Jewish state in Palestine. So these two goals kind of went hand in hand, like had been the decision in the early 20th century at Russian Zionist Congress in Helsinki. And with this agenda, they also, the Jewish self-government body, occasionally participated, for instance, via official delegates in the World Zionist Congress meetings.
How was it received or seen by Estonian powers? I mean, I mean, it could be perceived quite easily as some sort of like not an insurgent, but some sort of like anti-patriotic movement within the broader Estonian state. And of course, Jews were always under the scrutiny of people about their motives. Was it not seen as suspiciously by others? I mean, was it really respected? You said that the minority system was pretty advanced and pretty successful in Estonia, but was it really? I'm trying to understand whether it was really as ideal as one would tend to think.
So here, in Estonian society more broadly, the Germans were always the potentially dangerous minority in the view ofEstonians, and they always were afraid that whether they were loyal citizens, whether they sympathized with goals of Estonians, and in this broader framework, actually. Jews were always far less present in these public discussions or other such instances. But occasionally, in public discourse, it was mentioned that the Jewish self-government body is more looking towards Palestine rather than thinking about local affairs. But it was also something that, for instance, Yiddishist opposition said within the self-government body. And this is also more broadly, if we discuss the self-government or non-territorial autonomy model, it was seen as mainly cultural institution. And there was this initially very strong idea that we separate culture and politics, and these self-governments should deal exclusively with cultural affairs. But if they, for instance, the Estonian Jewish self-government decided to, on official capacity, to participate, for instance, in the World Jewish Congress, then the state, which kind of supervised these self-government bodies, it never intervened in such a case, although it would have been a cute excuse to say that you're now doing politics and you're not dealing with culture anymore.
Did the Jews of Estonia see themselves as a self-contained collective, or did they see themselves as sort of an affiliate of, I don't know, Russian Jewry, or maybe other communities in the Baltic region, maybe in Germany? How did they position themselves regionally?
Yeah, I think at this time period that I am focusing on, the interwar period and the late Tsarist period, here we can see basically the change of this identity. Of course, until the February Revolution and then the establishment of Estonian independent statehood, they were part of this broader Russian Jewry, and then they participated in the broader political processes and so on. And of course, now when Estonian independent statehood was established, they were basically cut away from this broader Russian Jewry with a new border. So they kind of established themselves in a way as Jews of Estonia, but they always also had good contacts regionally in the Baltic region. The self-government body, for instance, occasionally invited Jewish politicians from Latvia or Lithuania to give a talk, to give speeches, and so on, to participate in their electoral campaigns, for instance.
Was there also an exchange of ideas between the communities in Latvia and Lithuania, or perhaps an attempts to adopt similar models of minority politics?
To a certain extent, yeah, it was kind of exchange of knowledge and experience and so on. When, for instance, the Estonian Jewish communities convened and wanted to decide that should we now use this law, then they, for instance, invited Max Lazarsson from Latvia, which was a leading minority rights specialist there, and then asked basically his advice whether we shouldn't really now use the law. And then, many other minority leaders came and kind of learned from the experience of self-government in Estonia.
You were saying something about Jacob Robinson when I cut you off.
Oh, yeah. Jacob Robinson also visited Estonia and then as a part of the dominant National Bloc's electoral campaign, attended their election meetings to support their basically...
Because he was really one of the architects of the legal framework that allowed for this sort of policies to unfold.
Yeah, he was one of the leaders of Jewish minority rights movement in the Interwar period.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that actually the Jews of Estonia sort of benefited from the fact that they weren't the most outstanding minority in Estonia at the time? That the fact that, in a way they let the Germans do the bidding for them allowed them to enjoy an improved status as compared to other countries in Europe at the time?
To a certain extent, yes. But in scholarship, some scholars have stressed that Jews were only unintended beneficiaries of this agreement that it was kind of created for Germans of Estonia. And here I partially agree, but if you look at this Jewish activism for autonomy in the late Tsarist period in Russia, if you look how Estonian Jews convened and really mobilized around autonomy program, they carved their own ideas, how autonomy should work, what kind of powers they should have, then we of course have to emphasize their own strong agency and interest and engagement with autonomy model.
What happened to the Jews of Estonia after the outbreak of the Second World War and after the end of it, with their incorporation into the Soviet Union?
Yes, in summer 1940, actually the last elections to the Jewish Cultural Council were held. They had been planned many, many months before, and summer 1940 is basically when Estonia was incorporated into the Soviet Union. And in summer 1940, with the establishment of the Soviet rule, Jewish self-government was also abolished. And this is basically the moment when these two approaches to the national question basically were facing each other. One was this Soviet Union Stalinist approach, because Stalin had in early 20th century fiercely fought against this non-territorial Austro-Marxist autonomy model, and via new Soviet rule, this system was now abolished. The more leftist forces were now taking over the process, and all the former Jewish organizations were closed down and so on. And later on, when the Nazi German forces occupied Estonia during the war, basically this is where the most tragic part of the story begins. A large part of Estonian Jews had fled to the rest of the Soviet Union from the arriving Nazi forces, but roughly 1/3 who stayed in Estonia were basically all killed with the help of Estonian collaborators. And at the Wannsee conference, Estonia was already declared basically as a Judenfrei country. So it was really basically total destruction of the local Jewish community.
You said earlier that the idea of the self-government of the minority rights was predominantly cultural, and it was a lot about schooling, but also about representing the community politically as well. Can you spell out how that system actually worked in practice?
So individuals who joined, they could enjoy the benefits of the self-government, and this came with the obligations such as paying taxes and so on. There were regularly held the elections to the respective cultural councils, where different competing lists could run for the seats. And the broader meaning of this model within the society. One is schooling. You grant schooling in the respective national language, and you have the minority schools. But the other big field of activities was actually culture and organizing cultural events. And if having minority schools can have this kind of potential that you separate these groups, then culture was perhaps this field that brought different stratas of the society together, both, for instance, Germans and Jews. They held, for instance, organized art exhibitions, which were not necessarily only exclusively for the minorities or the one minority group only. These were very often events for the broader society and educated audiences who attended this. So this, I think, via culture, this kind of also, it kind of brought together different groups within the society. And this political meaning, yes, they were not really seen to be political institutions. But interestingly, when Konstantin Päts establishes his authoritarian rule and kind of designs the state according to corporatist model, then these self-government bodies are kind of refashioned as being part of this new corporatist system. And then in the new authoritarian era, Päts also establishes kind of token parliament, which wasn't really a parliament, it wasn't democratically elected, but one seat, for instance, was secured for minority self-governments. This was always filled by Germans because they were numerically much stronger than Jews, and in the committee they had always the more seats, and they could always elect their candidates. But
today in the newly sovereign Estonia, the post-Soviet stage, is any of that period remembered? I mean, the Jewish existence before the Second World War, and also, the rather advanced minority rights that were, I think, probably the most liberal and most democratic in the whole of Europe. Do Estonians take pride in that legacy today?
Well, more broadly in the 90s, when Estonia regained independence, then there was this strong interest in the interwar period, in many facets of this period. And of course, this minority rights legislation also was kind of revisited, and this is always repeated in school books and so on. And the other side to this story is, in the early 1990s, when Estonia regained its independence, then Estonian ethnic composition had also dramatically changed during the Soviet period, and then there was this big Russian-speaking minority. And in this transformation process, this old law was reintroduced in a much watered-down version. But also in the interwar period, basically, in addition to Jews and Germans, also Russians and Swedes could have qualified for autonomy. And Russians heavily debated about the necessity of establishing autonomy in the interwar period. But they reached the internal consensus in the late 1930s, but then it was already too late because the World War started, and this made this impossible.
Mm-hmm. So it's basically a story of Estonians and Germans in the interwar period.
To a very large extent, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Dr. Timo Aava, postdoctoral fellow at the Robinson Institute for the History of Individual and Collective Rights at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and to the Robinson Institute for their generous support. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto a Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close or maybe more than 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.